Hey everyone, it's 2 o'clock and we're ready to go. So hello and welcome, and thank you for joining the Basis Wednesday webinar. This one's on sustainable surfaces, and I'm Chris Whitaker, chair of the steering group at Basis, and in my day job I work for the ECB as a facilities and planning manager. So sustainable surfaces form a large part of my role within sport. So this is the 9th in the series of weekly discussions covering the wide and diverse brief of sustainable sport. We've covered a broad range of topics, from unlocking stadiums sustainably after the pandemic to the role that sport plays in wider society and in helping build cohesion and many of the other social outcomes it delivers. But I think our single overriding message, and it was very neatly summed up in a report published in the BBC and in The Guardian this Saturday, and the headline was, "Sport is heading for a fall as temperatures rise." And then, to quote the author, he said, "Global sport faces major disruption from climate change in coming decades. And by 2050, it's estimated that almost 1 in 4 English Football League grounds can expect flooding every year. But cricket, tennis, rugby, athletics, and winter sports will also face serious challenges from the impacts of rising temperatures." So if we take a moment to examine the premise of sustainability, it is to focus on meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. So today's subject matter explores that very premise. Okay, we're going to examine the role of artificial surfaces for the delivery of sport and the benefits they can bring to society, but also the challenges they pose in respect of the materials used in their composition and the end-of-life process of recycling or repurposing. So this will be a discussion in the round to recognise there is a debate to be had across the whole sports industry. Manufacturers, recyclers, commissioners, planning authorities, governing bodies. So not just a linear argument as to the merits or demerits of synthetic turf and artificial surfaces. We really want it to be a wider discussion. So to help with this, we do have a terrific panel, and I'd like to say thank you to all of them for coming onto the panel to help us discuss this. We also have a group of special guests who can provide a bit more insight around particular subjects. And again, thanks to them as well for agreeing to take part in this. I'll ask them to introduce themselves in a sec, and I'll facilitate the conversation through questions and things. I would just say there are 2 of them on this panel who have played international sport and have represented their country, and one of them has actually won a cup final as a captain of their local club, a national cup final. So I'll let them reveal who they are. Okay, so if I could start with Duncan, if you don't mind introducing yourself and just a quick sort of reprise.
Yeah, my name's Duncan Bennett. I'm Managing Director at Not Sport. We're designers and deliverers of artificial turf, sport, play and cricket facilities in the UK and abroad into Europe and further afield.
Thanks, Duncan. And Colin?
Thanks, Chris. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm not quite an international sportsman, but I'm currently in the Netherlands, so hopefully the Wi-Fi holds up. Thanks for inviting me. My name's Colin Young. I've been in the turf industry around 20 years. I currently head up research and development for an organisation called Tencate Grass. We're a manufacturer of synthetic turf components and systems. We're quite a vertically integrated company in that we get involved right from the raw material phase through manufacturing, installation, ongoing maintenance, and as of a few months ago, end-of-life recycling and repurposing. So we're covering all the bases when it comes to synthetic turf.
Thanks. Joey?
Yes, thanks, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. Great to be here, part of the discussion. I was a former international hockey player up until 2 years ago now for England and Great Britain. So I spent a fair amount of my life on these surfaces. So I'm hoping to bring that perspective to the discussion this afternoon, and really interested to hear from the more technical people on the panel as well around the technical aspects. And also have a real keen interest in sustainability generally, having transitioned from a sporting career. I now work in that sector, so it's great to be part of this discussion and bringing the two things I find really interesting and am passionate about, sport and sustainability, together, and bring it onto the field metaphorically. Yeah.
Thanks. So you're one of the internationals. Dennis?
I am Dennis Anderson, the founder of Re-Match Turf Recycling in Denmark. Currently the only facility that we have right now, building a new facility in Holland, coming online in France and UK and America very, very soon. Well, we started this back in 2013 and are continuing to chase the closed loop recycling, hopefully succeeding very, very soon.
Thanks, Dennis. Mark?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Apologies, I'm technical problems. I've not got any video, but it's probably just as well because I'm sat in the sunshine, really hot and sweaty. So it's just as well. I'm Mark Pover. I've been at the FA for 16 years, working on the facilities and investment side. I head up and I'm responsible for all the technical standards from the Football Association, links into the rules and the way in which football is played, certainly on synthetic turf, but also heavily involved in the investment side with our charity partner, the Football Foundation, and we've just entered into our third iteration of a third generation pitch framework, which until COVID, we intended to invest and build about 100 pitches a year. But we'll have to reevaluate that once we start getting back to normal.
Thanks, Mark. Niall?
Good afternoon, Chris, and thank you for inviting me onto the webinar. I'm from a company called SportsLabs. We're a global sports surfacing and technology testing institute representing or testing surfaces and technology for FIFA, FIH, World Athletics. I suppose my background is understanding surfaces, but also at the global governing bodies, we understand their strategies for implementing change. And one of the things that has been said recently is the players have to adapt in hockey to allow them to change to water-free surfaces. So things like that, we're involved in technical discussion groups. I do have a history with international sport from my country, captain Scotland, and also the club won the Scottish Championships when I was captain, but I won't tell you the sport because nobody will know it. So, so I'll leave you to guess. But yeah, looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, so we'll have a Q&A and we'll narrow the sport down. Ed.
Thanks, Chris. Good afternoon, all. Ed Hubbard from an organisation called 4Global. So we are sports consultants. We work across kind of the full ecosystem of sports from major events through to grassroots. We do a lot around facility strategy and investment strategy, so advising organisations on what to build, where to build it, and what some of the benefits could be in terms of a long-term investment.
Thanks, Ed. Lee?
Hi Chris, hello everyone. My name is Lee Fletcher. I represent Tudor Grange Academies Trust. We're linking up with our communities and maximising our facilities as best as we can. We're working with national governing bodies and trying to provide the best opportunities for our students and our community to play sports and achieve all the benefits that brings.
Thanks. Simon?
Yep, good afternoon everybody. Simon Dowdy, I'm England Hockey Facilities Relationship Manager, one of three that work across the country looking to support our clubs and facilities with their facility needs and issues, and with the overarching aim of making sure that we have the right pitches in the right place.
Brilliant. Thanks. Okay, so we'll dive into the conversation. Oh, sorry, I just want to say that there will be a Q&A at the end of the session, so you can pose your questions to the panelists then. But the chat function should be open, and Liam and Russell are going to monitor that. And if there are any burning questions, we can get that into the conversation. Okay, so as in the way of all webinars, we'll start off with a relatively straightforward question, just talking about kind of how you would define a sustainable surface, and then perhaps look at what constitutes a synthetic turf surface in particular. So if we start with Duncan as a distributor, that's correct to put you in that category.
I'll take it, yeah.
What your kind of definition would be?
Yes, it's a great starting question. So sustainability of services is key to what we do. We distribute, as you say, and supply services for sport, play and cricket, and each of those areas has a different requirement from performance, durability, aesthetic, and each of those areas therefore has a different sort of set of parameters for success, I suppose, for want of a better word. In terms of the sustainability side, then we work with, on the sports pitch side of things, 14 manufacturers of FIH, FIFA, World Rugby grasses, and FIH grasses. So we're keen to find and identify the surfaces that will meet the customer requirements in the short, medium and long term. And part of the way that we work is to provide long-term funding solutions. And that means that we are looking at business cases, life cost analysis of sports facilities in particular, from not just the first couple of years all the way through to sort of first point of resurface and beyond. So from my point of view, when we're working on a scheme, it's finding surfaces that perform the function that is required of that particular scheme, but then also working with the customer, part education and part learning to understand what their requirements are. And increasingly what we're finding is there's conversations with the customer sector about how can we future-proof the investment. So even if the surface needs resurfacing in 10, 12, 14 plus years, is there ways that we can manipulate the design or introduce components that will have a longer life, therefore arguably more sustainable life than a traditional pitch would have been built 15, 20 years ago or so. And that's where we're approaching the customer sector and working with manufacturers and component suppliers to provide a full rounded analysis of what's available on the market and trying to find the solutions that bring about innovation and added value at each stage.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point about extending the life of them, because, you know, obviously within the whole sustainability discussion, prolonging the life of them, you know, creates a longer use for them, and, you know, you get more outputs from them and the rest of it. So I just want to jump to Ed, if he doesn't mind, because if we're talking about the outputs from synthetic turf in particular, and obviously it's interesting, Duncan covers both artificial and natural, and you could say, you know, natural surfaces, there's the same story about, you know, the sustainability of natural surfaces. But the outputs from synthetic surfaces, Ed, are you able to give a sort of wide overview of, you know, the difference they would make and particular kind of circumstances where they sit very well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we look at it, kind of the benefits of a synthetic on all-weather pitch. Let's use those. In kind of a couple of different ways. We see more individuals getting the opportunity to use facilities, and that's a unique people. And we also see that people are using them for longer. Those two, the kind of combination of those two parts, increases the amount of value that's provided back into society. So we talk about social value, and I'll go into that into a bit more detail. And thirdly, really, the kind of keep a more diverse user base. So we see a wider range of people using facilities. And from that kind of point of view, that's a huge benefit. You know, in terms of some specific examples, you might see a typical football or rugby grass pitch might be used by a maximum of kind of maybe 50 unique people over the period of a week, just because of the wear and tear and the ability to kind of keep it usable over the season. You know, the numbers that we've seen at individual facilities, you could easily get 500 plus unique people at kind of your typical leisure centre AGP.
Yeah.
You get the right facility in the right place, and you know, Mark will tell us more about the park life schemes, but you know, we're talking up 1,000 up to kind of close to 2,000 unique people on a monthly basis using those facilities, and that's generating a complete step change in the amount of people that can use that facility. Again, I talked about social value. We look at how much social value that facilities generate, and we monetize that kind of through our partnership with Sheffield Hallam and their research. One of the park life schemes up in Sheffield, we calculated that they're generating about £550,000 worth of social value in over a year, and that's through education, entertainment, improved health, improved subjective well-being, and reduced crime. So kind of over that whole piece, it's about getting more people active. It's about getting more different people active, and that in the long term is much more positive for kind of the long-term health of the country.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so that does look at the kind of positive side of it. So then just to jump to you now, and the role you play through SportsLabs in looking at performance testing, and obviously the composition and makeup.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges we have at the moment is the type of infill we have in surfaces is an elastic material, and a lot of the new materials don't provide that cushioning or softening of an impact. So as we try to find environmentally friendly solutions to that infill, we're struggling as an industry, one, to produce volume of that material, and two, to find the material that gives that performance. And I think for me, Mark might touch upon this further in the line, but the framework in England use, for example, FIFA quality pitches. And around the world, we constantly ask for FIFA Quality Pro. So we're asking for elite facilities and elite certification. Do we need that in a community venue? And I think the answer is no. I think more than 90% of facilities are community-based venues. So when it comes back to tendering, consultancy, and what products we're asking for, I think we need to be more defined, and national governing bodies and global governing bodies can have a role in that part. We've seen a lot of new products come to the market, a lot of new infills getting tested, and there's a rush because of possible legislation down the line. But there's definitely innovation there. It's just trying to find out where it fits in facilities around the world. So there is an opportunity, but we need everyone to play their part in realising them products being brought to the market.
Thanks. So then, Dennis, just taking it sort of through the process, obviously, so talking about the definition of what makes up a sustainable synthetic surface, that poses challenges for you at the recycling end.
Well, I think, you know, what is sustainable today might be different in 3 years, because, you know, the technology is developing so fast. Today we see a lot of different polymers, we see a lot of different infills, which makes it kind of complicated, at least if you want to close the loop and go full circle. But, you know, there are technologies that potentially could change the game. There's a pyrolysis on the polymer side where you can bring it back into an oil and you can bring it back into a virgin polymer again. Maybe the carbon footprint of that process might be, you know, a little steep, might be too much, but people are working on it. And, you know, there's separation technologies out there that are able to separate these components from each other. But the manufacturers are not making it any easier for us with their wrapping yarn and you know, the face fiber, and you got a different backing, you know, primary, secondary backing. I mean, so what makes up a sustainable sport surface? That is the one that you can convert into a virgin polymer and bring it back into life. That's how I see it. I see it a little bit different than many others in terms of prolonging the life of the surface, because I think we're going to see a change eventually where we're going to have some pitches that we will convert prior, because we can capture the value of the polymers at an earlier stage and bring it back into life. Not many polymer manufacturers are happy about bringing material back that is 10 years old. So eventually, I think we're going to see a shorter lifespan, but maybe a cheaper option, because we can bring back some value when we convert the materials. So, but today, most pitches consist of an SBR infill. You got some TPEs and EPDMs out there. They're valuable as such. Now I think, in 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, we're going to see a massive change in that, because of all the various things that have been put out there, the cork, the geofill, and the various TPEs and EPDMs. You're really not making it any easier, at least to convert it and make value out of it. So, we got to have some money to process these materials. We got to find a home for it as well. If it can't go straight back into a new football field, then we got to find another home. And it all depends on the pricing that we get in that market. That the gate fee and the disposal cost will depend on that. So
thanks. Yeah, that's some interesting insight there. So, Colin, as a manufacturer, obviously this is where you step in.
Yeah, thanks. It's, I suppose, just for people on the call that might not fully understand the components that go into a synthetic turf system. But a lot of people just assume that synthetic turf is the green blades, the polymer fibers you see on the top, and maybe a bit of the loose rubber crumb if you're doing football, or sand if you're doing another sport, or water if you're doing hockey. So there's actually a lot more to it. And if we think about turf systems rather than carpet, then I think we get to think about the bigger picture, and actually a much more interesting sustainability and circular economy discussion. So most fields are built on a base, which is the foundation, which is a civil engineering operation, not too dissimilar from building a car park, with a lot of virgin stone, asphalt, and a lot of vehicle movement. Fairly inefficient, but needed to get the stable base you need. So that's kind of standard for most sports. When you start talking about the synthetic system that goes on top of that, between the base and the turf, you have something called often a shock pad or an E-layer, which again is primarily made out of polymeric materials. And that basically provides a bit of comfort and a bit of safety for the players. Above that, you have the synthetic turf, and that's made primarily of 3 main components. You have the synthetic turf yarns, which are predominantly polyethylenes, although there are a few others. You then have what's called a primary backing, which is normally a mixture of polypropylene, maybe some fiberglass, and some other materials. And then finally on the backing, you have a glue type substance, an SBR latex, which basically holds everything together and gives it stability. Now, at the moment, in order to meet all of the performance requirements and all of the things that Neil will be testing at SportsLabs and the other sports demand, there's certain things that we need to get the benefit from that wide range of different polymers, which presents a headache when it comes to recycling, because we've got different streams of materials which you need to physically separate before you can then recycle them. So it makes the process quite complicated. So one of the things that we're doing when we're looking at new materials, when we're looking at new systems, is trying to find the dream system, which is what we're calling the one DNA. So a system made out of the same polymer, from the same polymer family, that when it comes to the end of its life, it can effectively be rolled up, cleaned, and re-extruded back into a new system. Now, there are a few technical challenges there and quality challenges there, but that's the sort of thing that we're working on at the moment to try and close that loop. In the interim, I think there are some quite interesting approaches of downcycling is probably a bad phrase, but using some of those materials in a slightly different way, maybe within the construction of the system, to try and get a second life out of it, but maybe not at the high value that we want to. But there are some really interesting initiatives going on in those kind of areas as well.
Right, thanks. So the one perspective I'm really interested to hear from is from the international athlete perspective of having played on the surface and basically, Joey, presumably when you started your journey in hockey, it was on artificial surfaces. You didn't start on grass.
Thankfully, just missed that one.
So playing on the surface and the difference it made to you in terms of being able to play a sport, what would be your observations on that?
I think, yeah, I think obviously the surface is a massive part of the game and the evolution of the game. So taking, I guess, my sport of hockey, even just going back to the start of my journey, just on a sand-based pitch, so not necessarily water-based, which is I'm fortunate enough to play a lot of my hockey on now, and what kind of internationally gets played on is a top sort of surface, is the evolution of the game that the surface allows is huge. So in terms of the dynamism, the speed the game can be played at, you know, and therefore the sort of spectacle, as it were, the product of the game that the surface then allows, with that, you know, increased speed, increased skill that can come off that. If there's spongier surfaces, the ball can become in the air. There's a lot more dynamism and speed and, you know, value from that point of view from the surface. So I think some of the technical challenges around that, I think they've been alluded to by, you know, the more technical expertise there, in terms of still getting those performance benefits that are, especially at the, I guess I'm talking more an elite side there, but, you know, top level club hockey in this country as well, predominantly played on water-based surfaces, is still getting the sustainability side without the trade-off of that performance element. Is crucial, I think, then for the sustainability of the sport beyond just the sustainability of the surface. Yeah, I think that's my.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it is interesting because obviously all other sports have the option of grass as one of the other. And it's interesting that you went from, you know, playing into the kind of sustainability world, and, you know, now obviously work in the industry itself. So when you played, and amongst your colleagues, and I know you as an individual during the Olympics took on a role of trying to make certainly the event itself for hockey a bit more sustainable. I mean, is there chat amongst the players, or is it sort of very much a personal thing?
I think at sort of that elite level end, I think performance always comes first. So the sort of sustainability discussions, you know, how much water is required, that's, for hockey pitches in particular, that's a big factor, especially if you're playing in countries or conditions where it's dry, which we're going to see more of going forward with changing weather patterns, things like that, the water element. So in terms of where it's front of mind, at that point it's performance first, but I think at every level, and what's been also alluded to so far, I think, on the panel, is that where that value comes in and how the environmental side of those pitches, whether it's the water, whether it's the embodied carbon, you know, whether it's the end of life use, is how that value is packaged up at every stage, so that ultimately players and spectators and people involved in the sport can be confident that, or at least reassured that the conversations around sustainability and presenting the sport in the best way possible and taking into those accounts. And as we've said, this is very much a journey, you know, 2-3 years time, those things will look different, and it won't be perfect, and in being transparent about that, but actually the conversations are happening, the technology is coming, the investments are being made, and I think that's really important to be showing to the sporting industry and to players.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Mark, then, so Mark Pover from the FA. Obviously the FA plays a big role in commissioning new surfaces and is rolling out a program which was alluded to a bit earlier. Mark, could you just give us a bit more kind of detail on that, and you know, where the FA, when it looks at those big sorts of programs, you know, what in terms of the commissioning process and the procurement process, where the sort of embedded sustainability part comes into it.
Yeah, so just to take on your very earlier point, Chris, football needs to be played on both artificial and grass pitches. There aren't enough artificials. We're way behind Europe, even though we have 3,000 plus pitches. They are really well used, and they're a really good value for the players and people taking part in physical activity. And we all know about the health and social well-being benefits of sport in general. An average full-size pitch would be near on 2,000 hours a year, with approximately about 1.8 million users on the current stock of pitches we have, which equates to about 90 million hours of use per annum. So, significant value to the sport. And they're not just, our investment doesn't just allow football to be played. The surfaces are suitable for rugby, for training purposes, rugby league as well. So they have benefits beyond just the football as a sport. But yeah, you're right. I mentioned earlier that we've had a third OJU compliant framework, 4 years. So this is our third term. We've had 8 years worth of framework, and in many ways, what we entered into initially was to perhaps challenge the industry to do things right. To make sure that what we were building and what we were investing in was quality and value for money, and making sure that upmost in all of this was that the players get the right quality experience that they were looking for. Because the biggest complaint that we've had year on year when we do our grassroots survey is players are saying that the surfaces they play on, in particular grass, are turning them off the sport and not giving them the sort of experience and the sort of value that they would probably put into it. So the economic value of playing sport and playing football is quite significant, and we estimate that football's worth about £10.7 billion a year to the UK economy. Because of the investment we're making, but also the way in which football generates income and generates interest around the sport itself. So there are significant benefits to that. Part of the issue that we've had, and I see Dennis and Colin and others that I've been working with for many years now, in trying to find the right solution to continue to invest, but also to make sure that whatever we're investing in is right for the environment, right, and it's the right surface and the right product to give us the outputs, but also being a very high-profile company that also has a high-profile partner, or two high-profile partners in the Premier League and the government. We're very much at the forefront, and we'll be the people that will be kicked first if we're not doing what we're expected to do and what we want to do, which is try and make those surfaces as sustainable and as recyclable as possible, and make sure that whatever happening in the industry, what innovation is happening in the industry, we're at the forefront and we're ready to take it on board, so long as it's tried, tested, and gives us that player experience that we're looking for.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, it is an interesting, very interesting discussion, because, as I say, obviously the FA, in terms of the sheer quantity and the scale of what they do, is going to have the biggest influence on what happens in terms of how the surfaces are produced and then recycled and repurposed. So I wanted to just go back to Dennis, and so within that recycling purpose, within the recycling cycle, okay, and in terms of what's, I suppose there's two sides, and there's already what's out there, made up of what it's made up of, and then there's what's to come. So from your perspective as a recycling business, what's already out there is, I suppose, the biggest challenge for you. And then in terms of what's to come, presumably the process would be different in what you produce, if you like. And you did kind of allude to it about the repurposing.
I think what's to come, I don't know. Colin can probably answer that one. So far, I haven't seen anything new. I think they twist the yarn a little bit different and maybe give it a different color. So far, I haven't really seen any spectacular things coming across. They still manufacture the turf the same way as before, same components. So, you know, I know what I'll be doing for the next 15, 20 years. That is to clean up what we got out there. But I think, you know, there are some new technologies that are coming to life now where we can process those kind of materials. So, but going back to, you know, to a monostream, to have one single polymer, that will make life so much easier. And then, you know, we can discuss whether we should have an infill or not, but then you need to redesign the whole system. As Colin was saying, you know, there's a sub-base to deal with here as well. Maybe we can do it smarter, better. And there has to be some kind of innovation. And you know, problem is that we probably haven't done much of that in the past 10, 15 years. But I think, you know, cleaning up and bringing it back into a closed loop, I think that's going to happen. With the materials that we have today, we cannot convert everything. We got a primary backing and a secondary backing that is really terrible. You know, polypropylene with glass fiber and SBR latex. I mean, it's a bunch of fillers that are in there. It's very difficult to make a closed loop on that one. There are some new materials available out there that I know that people are testing with, where you can also recycle that fully. It will take time. It really will take time. So for now, you got a downcycling, as Colin mentioned. You know, we are prolonging the life of that material, and we can keep doing that. But chasing the closed loop is key for everybody. And then designing the future turf systems, well, we got to get busy. Really, that's where we need to start, and then we can go back and clean up what we.
Yeah.
So,
Thanks.
Interesting. Next 2 or 3 years, it's going to be extremely interesting to see what we can come up with.
Thanks, Dennis. So, Colin and Niall, obviously, if you two could just, between the two things here, so there's the regulatory side of it, which Colin, you're obviously involved with through the ESTC, as and then obviously Niall from the kind of performance and the compliance side. And you know, if you sort of speak between each other, that would be interesting to hear on that side. So is there regulation in the pipeline? You know, where are we up to at the moment? Is it possible in terms of the different materials? And it might be worth maybe just diving into a little bit of technical detail, because there are probably a lot of people out there. And you know.
I'll kick off, Chris. What I'll say is that I think the global governing bodies find themselves in a very big predicament. They're all wanting to adapt, you know, with the environmental friendly products in the market, but it's very, very difficult, because at the moment they're finding they're not meeting the elite categories, the performance required, you know, elite hockey, elite football, and that's a challenge. So we've seen a lot of products without the infill. We've seen a lot of products with different yarns, different backing types. But when we design pitches and we tend to evaluate pitches, you're looking at a period of maybe 10 years life expectancy. So when you hear things about biodegradability, compostability, how long's a pitch got to last for, and how do these materials break down, and what's been proven? And we're currently in a predicament now where there's no pitches that have that long life expectancy and evidence, you know, to be scored well in a tender process, or be, I suppose, recognised by governing bodies. So we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. And although there's technology there, it's big decisions. And I'll go to one country as an example. So in Sweden, we test fields, and in Sweden they've gone towards non-fill products with sand infill. Now, a cynic would say that's going back to sand-dressed hockey pitches, the 2G surfaces, and that's what football's getting played on. But the problem is those pitches might not last longer than 3 or 4 years. We don't know yet, because they've only just been installed the last 3 or 4 years. So in terms of facilities and how long they can be used for, we're in a very difficult position, and big decisions need to be made about taking risks with public funding. Legislation might encourage that, might force it, but at the moment there's not that legislation in place yet. And one of the things we were going to discuss today was about the research we did in the questionnaire. And the questionnaire was trying to identify the barriers that are preventing these products from being taken into the market and being adopted in high volume. So we're stuck in a place at the moment between a rock and a hard place, where we need people to take risks, to make decisions, have prototypes and trial beds and test beds. We're getting there, but slowly, as Dennis alluded to.
Thanks, Neil. Just from my side of things, so one interesting initiative that's happening at the moment on a European-wide level, the European Synthetic Turf Council, ESTC, has successfully been awarded by the EU an opportunity to pull together it's called a PEF-CR, PEF-CR, which is a product environmental footprint category rule system. So it's part of the European Union's single market initiative for green products. And it basically combines two different methodologies of environmental performance. One is kind of a life cycle analysis through a product environmental footprint, and one is a organizational environmental footprint, how things are produced and how things perform over the use of their life. And this is a really robust program. It's backed by the European Union, and it should hopefully allow in the next 18 months to 2 years a mechanism by which any supplier or manufacturer of synthetic turf systems can fill in the materials they use, how they produce them, what the design is, what base they're using, how they can be recycled at the end of life, and they can be given an overall score on these different categories. It will be linked in with European tendering regulations and rules. Of course, for the UK, I'm not quite sure how that will work, but I don't think anyone does. But it's good news in the sense that we'll have a bit of uniformity, because one of the issues we're seeing at the moment is because of the need for change, and a lot of companies are really trying to do the right thing, including our competitors, which I don't like to say, but I think most of the industry is trying to do the right thing. We're going off in different directions, we're using different data sets, and I have a very big worry that we'll start to have different values, different things, and we maybe be accused of greenwashing by going in different directions and saying different things. So hopefully this new scheme will coalesce around it as an industry, and we'll have a really good way that will allow specifiers, designers, architects, and people buying the facilities a real simple, easy way to understand it on a really robust framework. So that's quite exciting. I'm chairing the group at ESTC that's responsible for that, but we also are working very closely with the European Commission on these sort of single market green product initiative. So we've done a great job as ESTC to get on this scheme. There's not many industries that have been involved. We're one of the first. So that's great. And that will be very, very, very comprehensive. It will cover almost everything from beginning to end and reuse. So that's good. And hopefully that will start to allow a little bit of comparison and contrasting. And going to just sort of adding on to the second part to some of the questions that Neil had, it's really key that we don't use these different family polymers at the moment because we necessarily want to. We use them because they're the ones that allow us to meet the standards for the length of time at a price point that the market will pay. We can make single polymer DNA systems today, and maybe there's a slight compromise in performance, maybe there's a slight compromise in longevity, and maybe there's a slightly higher cost. But in most marketplaces, they won't tolerate those things without a good reason and good evidence for them. Now, of course, we'll improve over time, and I know Neil's testing a lot of systems for a lot of people, and hopefully he sees that progression ongoing. But it's not something that's going to happen tomorrow. It's going to be several years of developments and innovations until we get to parity with where we are today, with maybe systems that aren't quite as sustainable as they could be in the future.
Yeah, just to add to Colin's point there about to take a product to market, you're a bare minimum about 6 months, you know, even if you were to create that product overnight, because you have to do UV testing and it has to sit in a cabinet exposed to moisture and UV light for 6 months. Now, product design, doing in-house testing, R&D, you're probably looking at 2 years to take a product to market. So, you know, there's, in terms of all this legislation and public documentation at the moment, we're trying to catch up with that, and we need to get ahead of it in the future. And that's a challenge for Colin and all these manufacturers. And sometimes the knowledge transfer can confuse people. So it needs to be clear, and the greenwashing side of it needs to be clear, and it needs to be evidentially based. So we're getting there. You know, we're learning lessons through the microplastics issue at the moment, and how to be proactive rather than reactive. But we are working very hard, and as Colin says, not just us and him, it's our competitors that are all working in groups to try and make the information freely available, transparent, and so people can make educated decisions.
And just one example that might be relevant for certainly one of the people on the call. If we look at water-based hockey fields, and we know the FIH have made the grand claim that the Paris Olympics in 4 years' time now is supposed to be water-free. The chief executive of the FIH made this claim about a year ago. A very bold statement. Now, technically, today, I can make a water-based system that doesn't need any water. And I can meet all of the performance criteria. Neil and his team can test it and certify it, and it can meet all of the criteria that the FIH lay down for an Olympic level competition. But I guarantee that no hockey player would want to play on it dry. They'd want to play on it with water. So there might need to be not only a compromise in some of the other performance criteria, but there might need to be a compromise from players. And when you're saying that to Olympic players, I don't think they're used to compromising on those kind of things because they're the elite of the elite. So that's maybe an interesting point to take up.
It's a really good point, Colin, and I have a question for Joe, actually. So when you talk to the FIH, they always refer to India being the world champions when they played on natural grass surfaces, and as soon as it changed to artificial, obviously India slipped down the world rankings. So if, for example, the FIH were to come tomorrow and say to you, right, we're banning water-based pitches, because that's a movement. They've gone from fully water to reduced water systems, and now they're pushing water-free systems. I mean, how would that affect you as a player and your performance on the pitch?
Yeah, I think it would be different. I can't speculate how like a water-free pitch would play in comparison to a water-based pitch. In terms of, I suppose, the performance from the manufacturing side, if you're saying it's still Olympic level, I think from a player's point of view, there's got to be a long enough period of adaptation to get the players on board. I think that's really important. So that the fact that this has been talked about for Paris, and yeah, I heard that claim as well last year. You know, that could only be 4 years away now. Maybe 3 years if the Olympic goes ahead next year. You know, you've got a condensed period for the next Olympics, and I think it's players want a time frame to be able to adapt properly, and transparent communication about the positioning and the reasoning for that. And then, the availability of those pitches and how quickly, because to those elite players who need the time to adapt, and they've worked for years on water-based surfaces, I think it's I completely understand the reservation from a player point of view, but I think that's where a conversation and a transparent conversation would be really useful. So it's not just sprung upon players that this is where it's going, and next week or next year, this is the kind of totally different surface that you're playing on. It's what are the differences, making that really clear. What are the potential impacts? What is the adaptation time or the timescales that these pitches are coming in on? And ultimately, what's the broader vision around them? And I think, yeah, it's certainly a discussion from that point of view.
Thanks.
But I can see from an initial proposition, players be like very defensive perhaps, because like you say, at elite level, this is what they've been training for years at, and actually it's being sensitive to that, but having in mind the bigger picture about the sorts of evolution and the sorts of game-changing changes that do need to happen to bring the environmental side of things into this equation, and ultimately the sport as a bigger picture of making it more accessible in, you know, water scarce places and things like that. Yeah.
Thanks, Jay. Simon from England. So at the, obviously your role as a relationship manager in the recreational game, which is a very different area. Be interesting to hear the work you've done with the FA, for example, where there's been opportunities to share some kinds of surfaces. Could you and Mark just kind of maybe talk a little bit about that, and if there's a future in that, or if there isn't, or you know what? Well,
it's interesting. Actually, going back to what Joey's just said about the adaptation time for pitches, I think that's if I can just answer or add something to that, I think there does definitely need to be a longer period, not just for the international players, but it's that higher level of the domestic game also, who primarily now play on water-based pitches. There will be a lot. There will be whatever the pitches go to in the future will obviously come down into that higher level, and there will need to be time. Cost will be a massive factor for that, for the development of our higher end players. So that I think is a really interesting thing that the game will have to think about. In terms of at a grassroots level, we have about, Mark was saying, I think it's about 3,000 3G pitches. We have around about 1,000 sand-dress pitches. 800 of them are used by clubs. Others are used in independent schools where there isn't any community access. We do have at the moment a policy whereby league matches aren't able to be played on 3G, but 3G is able to be used for development, so low-level school play, beginner, back to hockey, really low-level development play. 3G at a 40 mil height is acceptable. When it gets to 60 mil, which is obviously what the FA and Football Foundation primarily fund, then that becomes difficult, for many reasons, ball roll, player perception, their experience, but also maybe with lower skilled players, the chances for the ball to rise underneath 60 mil is much greater than a 40 mil. So there's all sorts of issues that, to be honest, we're nervous about, and our player feedback says this is not a good game, which is why we've moved away from playing 3G, because we can put 3Gs down, we can have a 40 mil 3G, but players primarily will walk with their feet, and clubs, and they will go and find the nearest sand-dress pitch, because whatever that is, it's a better experience for the players, and also the coaches and the club, and all those sorts of things. So we do have some pitches which are used for both, very much on a lower level. Probably the highest level we have is actually in London. Hampton Westminster Hockey Club have a second pitch which is 40 mil 3G, but that's quite a rarity in the sport. The big conversations with Football Foundation and ourselves, and if we are going to lose pitches to a resurface to 3G, then we'll often try and persuade that they go to 40 mil, so they are used more often for that very low level school activity. And it would tend to be in a school environment that that would happen.
So and I mean, conversely, obviously football players are happy to play on sand-dress, to practice at least.
Whether they're happy.
Well, you know, they'll do it. Let's put it that way.
They will do it. And that's one of our, in terms of our strategy, obviously we need to make sure that when we talk about sustainability within the facility relationship managers, we're actually very often not thinking about the environmental sustainability. We're thinking of financial and whether the model that if we put a hockey pitch down, whether it is sustainable in terms of finance. So what we're looking at is at the end of life, whether that can be resurfaced, whether there is a model there, and that very often it isn't purely hockey specific. So we will always be looking for football use, and again, it won't be. Mark will obviously back this up, but it won't be competitive football, but it will be recreational, informal football, which may actually sit outside of the whole FA structure.
Yeah.
Dads will go jump to the goalposts. So.
Yeah, no, thanks for that view from the recreational level, because obviously that's in fact where the most participants of sport sit, is in the recreation game, not at the elite level. So just to change tack slightly and sort of go back a little bit in the process, Duncan, Lee, and Ed, and Mark actually will probably jump in on this as well. Just to talk about the commissioning process when it comes to, so Lee, if we could start with you, and obviously the role you play at Tudor Grange Academies in terms of commissioning new sites. I think you and I sort of had a little discussion before this about what is there something in your process in terms of your procurement process that specifies around the products that are used and the way, and of course when we're talking about an installation, and Duncan can talk a bit more about this, it's not just the surface, it's all the rest that sits around it, the lighting, the fencing and all the rest. So yeah, I know we've talked a little bit about planners who ask for these things to be done. And then Ed, again, if you could just chip in about in terms of, again, analytics and the availability of school sites, obviously, so that you're not like doubling up, having two sites next to each other, where you could be using one or the other, and that in terms of sustainability makes sense. Yeah. Okay, so Lee, start with you. Yeah, you'll have to unmute yourself. Well, there you go.
Sorry. Yes, sustainability is very important. It's not actually a rigid part of the procurement process. However, for example, as a trust, we look at local suppliers and contractors, LED lighting replacements, solar panels, even where not required on school buildings. But as regards the actual AGP surface, we want a sustainable surface that's going to last and be effective. And a good example is a project I'm working on with Not Sport at the minute, where we're currently looking at a shock pad over an in-situ rubber drum. Now, while this is going to cost more, clearly, double, I believe, it will last double the time. And I think as a school representing our students, staff and communities, there is this very important emphasis on sustainability. So we're very keen to take that forward. Even as far as planning applications are going, increasingly the sustainability and green agenda is very important. We've got a 3G project where we're having to reinstate 3,500 square metres of species diverse grassland, and that's something we never had to do, say, 5 years ago. So I think regards the procurement process, in terms of sustainability being a distinct value, I think that is on the horizon, but currently, while it's very, very important, it isn't a distinct part of the process, but we do endeavour to do it where we can.
I think just to pick up your question, Chris, around kind of how we balance school provision and non-school provision. A lot of the work that we do with local authorities, with national organisations, is around kind of the total stock of all weather pitches, and kind of the overall objective is making sure the total stock of provision of all weather pitches of AGPs is sufficient for the local population. And if the customer journey is the same, the customer doesn't care whether it's in a school or whether it's in a public, or whether it's in a leisure centre or whether it's in a dedicated place. As long as they've got the same journey through the facility, they really don't care. So we absolutely have to understand, we have to first point of call is making as many kind of high quality education facilities available for members, and getting those processes kind of in place so that people can go and use them as they would kind of a leisure centre or a dedicated facility. If that's not possible, then we need to understand why, but then we do need to invest in specific facilities. I think one of the opportunities around all weather pitches is the wider offer. So perhaps around kind of during the day, during off-peak hours during the day, and there is a real value in terms of getting new groups active, kind of a wider number of people, a more diverse user base, and therefore that is sometimes more difficult on a school facility because you just don't have access during those hours, which is completely understood. But I think the key is having a mixed model, but absolutely maximising the usage of all of the high quality facilities in the education sector. And just
yeah, sorry, Duncan.
I was going to say, just picking up on those 2 points and on this topic, I think we focused a lot on the actual surface itself at the moment, which is understandable because that's the big visible 7,500 square metre bit that everybody plays on and sees. And we mentioned right at the start about sustainability of the total sort of construction, if you like, so probably what we call sustainability of the actual design. And what we're seeing on the every project we do now, new build, is the requirement from good design practice, but also planners and general sort of sustainable approaches to encompass sustainable thought and design and good practice in everything from the surface to the sub-base solution to drainage. There's some development even on perimeter fencing with more sustainable solutions and innovation on that side. And also, as Lee mentioned, LED lighting and sustainability on lighting. So that all forms part of what we do as a business in terms of working with customers like Lee on the hockey pitch that we're working with him on, so that the customer sector understands what the options are out there, how you can make a facility traditional, if you want to call it that, in terms of a solution, but also in bringing forward new innovation and solutions for the customers to consider, like the shock pad Lee mentioned, the LEDs that we're doing on that pitch on the tennis court, the tennis courts element of the project, amongst other bits and bobs. So yeah, and I think the service is always going to be a key bit, and Colin and others on the panel can talk far more with authority than I can in the detail and polymers associated with that. But in terms of sustainability design, that's a key thing. That, as Lee mentioned, probably even 4 or 5 years ago, wasn't something that we were necessarily being as focused on as we should be, that we are now as an industry.
Thanks. I'm just going to had a question through which whoever decides they can answer it in the best way can do it live. So the question was: is embodied energy / carbon being considered in these sports services, with the emergence of science-based carbon targets and net zero carbon capturing and tracking? This is going to be critical as organizations adopt these targets. Someone want to answer that?
Hi, Chris. I'm not sure about the terminology and some of those words that I mentioned, but I think those kind of targets of giving a figure on levels of carbon use and longevity and all those things will be covered within the PEF-CR process. So to some extent they'll be there and they'll be considered. How they're reported, how they're presented is yet to be determined, but it will follow European Union advice on ways that other industries have done it, and it might well be linked with playing hours, with longevity, with playing hours per person, those kind of things. So it's still a little bit up in the air, but I hope that certainly those important things that were raised in that question are certainly considered and included within the presentation of the PEF-CR data sets. On a slight aside, but relatively linked topic, there's some really interesting projects that we're getting involved with in terms of water harvesting on fields. So we've got 8,000 squares where we can capture that water filter that water, and then either put it back on the field or use it to irrigate the natural fields around, or clean it and put it back into the drinking water, into grey water. There's heat exchange systems that we're looking underneath the field. Phase shift materials where we can cool things down and heat things up as they transition between solids and liquids. Now at the moment, these technologies are a little bit aspirational and a little bit expensive, but we're already working on them, and there's some interesting pilots ongoing, which hopefully will start to become a little bit more mainstream over the coming years, and scalability will allow them to be more affordable, and maybe even use that 7,000-8,000 squares of a facility to generate electricity, hot water, and other things that will feed back into the club and maybe into the local grid.
Thanks. So actually, then to follow up on the next kind of thing that's come up mostly on the chat is around microplastics. So the question here was to reduce the loss of microplastics to the environment. Is there scope to make it compulsory for new and potentially existing pitches to have something in place to reduce the loss? For example, barriers at the edges of pitches, brushes for players to remove crumbs from their kits, etc., etc. So Niall, you might want to jump in on that one.
Yeah, I'll just quickly go back to the last one, Chris, about carbon footprint. One of the questions we had in the market research questionnaire we did was, how accessible is recycling or reusing materials? Now, one of Dennis's, I suppose, business model plans and what people are trying to do is make them accessible. And distance traveling with a lot of material, even if it goes down to the stone in the base, is a problem for our industry. And when, for example, if Duncan at Knott's comes with a design and build solution where they can use something other than stone, it does reduce the carbon footprint as well, as long as the manufacturing process is monitored. So there is a lot of innovation coming, and I suggest that in the future these recycling or reuse plants to repurpose the material will be more available. That's the challenge. It's a commitment to invest in these facilities. So yeah. So jumping on to the next point, Chris, can you just re-question that?
Yes, it was about microplastics and basically containing them within the pitches so that you didn't have you reduced the amount of loss. And was there a way of cleaning them, putting in barriers or being able to clean them off your kit?
Yeah, there's a draft EN document that's just been published, and it's probably the quickest EN document ever to be published in sports surfaces, and that is mitigation of microplastics. Now we're in a situation where microplastics is getting discussed further about potential bans, but that's not going to come in, probably till 2028 or 2029 if that happens. So at the moment there is a draft EN. There's also FIDRA, which has pitch-in documents that gives very good practice. So there is documents out there to help people design and build their pitches better for managing the microplastics, and simple things like detox areas, runoffs, kickboards at a certain height. These simple things make a big difference to how we prevent the microplastics from exiting the pitch.
Chris, if I can just follow on there, Chris.
Yeah.
From the FA's point of view, the framework we have, we've introduced those designs into our framework. And there's also an FA guidance document that talks at length about containment and the sort of measures that should be put in place. And we're having discussions about retrofitting those to a lot of the facilities that we've constructed over the last 10 to 15 years. So yeah, there's a lot of work being done on that. And as I say, it's been built into our framework alongside the employers' requirements around closed loop recycling. So there's a lot that's been done. It's just not very interesting to those outside of the industry, so not many people know about it.
I was going to say it's certainly not the sexy part of the industry, is it? But an absolutely crucial part. And it's thanks for jumping in, Mark, because I was going to ask the question, and presumably in terms of your the FA's financial commitment, it's something kind of else that has to get added into that the pot of money that's available. And retrofitting is often a difficult one to get across the line. Yeah,
it's also looking at other, we've talked about innovation and looking at alternatives, and we're piloting hybrid pitches. So the artificial park grass, interested in this discussion about FIH, and it may be that they move to grass, albeit they don't realise it's actually predominantly sort of artificial.
Yeah.
Under the state, has put a very, very stable surface. So to go back to Simon's point, where we need to, we can perhaps look at a range of different options on specific sites, certainly some of the larger sports sites, and find solutions that fit a number of sports, not just football. And we're trialing those at the moment and putting them in different locations across the game, from our national league into community environments. And two of those projects have been underway for a few years now. One at Regent's Park and one at Bisham Abbey in Marlow, where we've got these hybrid pitches being tested to see how long they will get used, how much use they can get. On average at the moment, they're averaging around 26, 27 hours of use a week.
Yeah.
But the players think it's grass. For us, if that's a more suitable alternative to constructing the 3G because of the environment or where it is or how it is, we've got lots of football sites that are in public parks where you can't put a 3G or floodlights. There are also other environment areas where we would need to consider this, and we need to find surfaces that can take a lot of use, but are also relatively easy to manage and maintain. And going back to your point, are well drained, so that if they do flood, they're able to cope with significant rainfall or potential flooding.
Yeah. I, as alluded to in that report in the Guardian and the BBC this weekend, talking about the incidents, much increased incidents of flooding, certainly the lower leagues, and what impact that would have on the playing of the game. Thanks. So I'm just interested in the panel and their kind of feeling. So Niall, you were saying about, in terms of microplastics and the kind of legislation and the EU regulations coming in 2028. Do you get a feeling that perhaps things are going to get speeded up because, the kind of urgency around climate change is far more in the public perception now, and, people are not prepared to kind of wait around for 8 years for things to happen?
Yeah, definitely. I think, the 2028, 2029 is a possible legislation across EU territories. Now, the UK obviously might not adopt that. They might. It depends if it comes in and if they want to or if they don't. But I suppose the point is that we're starting to react, and it's people starting to realise that there's a lot of research that's been done, and a lot of this research is theoretical research that sometimes doesn't work in practicality on the site. So if you talk about mobilisation of the infill, do we actually know how much infill leaves a pitch? There's been a lot of studies getting done quickly to try and find that out, because some studies before have been inaccurate. I suppose the point is that there's an onus on everyone, every stakeholder, to have an input to this. And at SportsLabs, when we talk to pitch owners, we talk to pitch owners about managing high use areas. Something as simple as that, the entrance and exit of a pitch, can lengthen the lifespan of your pitch. And if Mark's talking about hybrid pitches, I suppose hybrid or reinforced areas of natural grass and goal mice will really affect how that pitch can be used. So these small things, from the people making the material right the way through to the end user and the manager of that facility, have a part to play. There is going to be legislation. It's coming. I don't know what it's going to be, but we're going to have to react and find solutions for this. So yeah, it's coming, Chris. We've had PHs in rubbers, we've had microplastics. We're potentially talking about other elements in the builds of not just artificial but the hybrid products, because essentially they are artificial yarn. So there's momentum, to try and reduce the amount of artificial materials in our system. So we're going that direction, yes.
Yeah, no, thanks. Dennis, you obviously said in when you were talking about 20 years in terms of trying to cope with what's already out there. I mean, again, do you think that that's going to get speeded up? And I know it's about capacity and building capacity, but
well, depends. I mean, the market can demand it, right? I mean, from a European commission standpoint, I think it's going to drag out. That's what I heard, at least, that this will take a while because this is microplastic as a general, not just football. I mean,
Yeah.
Artificial turf pitches, it's about 1% of the entire microplastic theme that we're discussing. So it's nothing. So it's going to take some time before they make that decision. I'm quite sure. But it's going to change, and that means we got to have multiple units that can separate these components. We got to look at the value streams that we put in. So it's going to be more diverse. It's going to have multiple companies coming into play, like the GBN in Holland coming online as well. I mean, there's room for so many people to process these different kinds of materials. I mean, you cannot build one machine that fits all and capture value from all these different streams.
Yeah.
The market decides whether they want it or not right now. I mean, you saw the German market, it adapted quite quick last year. They hardly don't use any polymeric infill in Germany anymore. I mean, overnight. For a reason, yes, but maybe a little bit too fast.
Okay, interesting.
The market can demand it quicker than we can follow, and then Colin will be big.
And I think that's a really, really good point. It's the first time in the past, I'd say, I can't put an exact time frame on it, but probably 12 or 18 months where, regularly we're being asked by customers of all sort of types, whether that be an independent school that might be perceived as having more of a budget than an academy or a trust or even a sports club. But the customer sector, when we go and speak about pitches, either a resurface or a new build, if it's a resurface, we're being asked what happens to the surface, where does it go, what can we do to provide the best solution, and what cost. But equally on new builds, we're being asked, how can we design sustainably, I suppose, as I keep going back to, but also what innovation is there in terms of surfacing solutions. And so, as Dennis said, if the customer starts asking, people like Colin, who I can see on my screen, and others in the industry will start getting asked by people like myself to find the solutions. Whereas I'd argue, even just a few years ago, it was infrequent requests or questions on that side. So I think the fact is the customer is starting to ask the questions, and that will drive innovation, which is a great thing. And the fact we're talking about it in a platform like this is probably a good sign that
well, and that was very much the purpose of this. Okay, I'm going to ask Russ and Liam, who've been kind of monitoring the chat, to ask some questions of the panel from what they've been seeing. Russ and Liam, are you able to come into the conversation? Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, fire away.
Okay, we've had a question from Paul, who says, it's not just microplastics which campaigners are concerned about. The majority of plastic additives used in pitches, players are exposed to all kinds of plastic and hundreds of additives, from hormone disruptors like BPA and BPF. So have any players been tested, is the question Paul asks.
A big question, right?
I don't know if we can.
Do we have the expertise in the panel to answer that one?
I'll take that question very quickly. Obviously, with the COVID going on and what's the pathogens that are in pitches, there is ways to test pitches, but we are looking at testing pitches. But the problem is a lot of these travel with the human. So as soon as a human goes on the surface, then that surface could be contaminated again. So in terms of testing, and it's a very complicated subject, and sometimes it's down to public confidence, or sometimes it's down to certain organisations suggesting to use it, or some don't. So it's a very difficult subject to discuss short.
Just from someone that makes the fibres, the base polymer that people are going to be coming into contact with is polyethylene. Polyethylene is prevalent in huge numbers of plastics and huge numbers of applications. So there's nothing that is particularly special about what we're doing to our plastics that isn't being done in many domestic and everyday plastics within cars and within other areas that you'd be constantly coming into contact with. So whilst we can't definitively prove a negative. There's no evidence of any incidents of higher exposure or problems from fields that we're aware of, but we, of course, one of the things we have to do, and any material we use, any additive we put in there, any stabilizer to control sunlight and things like that, all has to be validated and certified to REACH and European Chemicals Agency to make sure that they're non-damaging or toxic or harmful to humans through exposure, through eating, or through any other kind of interaction with them. So the base materials that are used all go through that REACH process as well. So there's a few safety areas in there, in addition to the sort of the final surface testing that SportsLabs and others will be doing.
Yeah, just to add very briefly to Colin's points there, a lot of the tests we've done previously on the components in artificial turf relate to the toy standard, so children's toys. So we're looking at the same level of tolerances in the materials and the products. So there is a lot of detail that goes into that, and REACH covers a lot of that that detail as well if you want to read it.
You're muted, Chris.
Russ, any other questions?
We did have one question about the actual the derivation of the polymers. Are all of the polymers for pitches oil-based? Are there any alternatives, perhaps even bio-based, or other recyclate actually going into pitches at the moment, or is it purely oil-based polymers that go in?
Yeah, I can answer that, and feel free if someone wants to jump in. I don't want to dominate. In terms of the yarns that we produce, and I think it's probably similar for other yarn extruders in the marketplace as well, the vast majority is still oil-based polymers. We can use bio-based polymers from plants, various plants, including sugarcane and things like that, and we have done some trials and some tests there. The difficulty with that is, in order to grow the sugarcane and to harvest it, you need to use a lot of land. You're potentially knocking down rainforests to replace that for growing sugarcane and other similar materials. You're also taking away land, productive land, from making food goods and diverting a valuable source in places that can least afford to have their food production disrupted. On top of that, you've got a huge amount of water, so you're diverting rivers. You've got a huge amount of fertilizer to help them grow. So if they're done sustainably and they're checked, I think they can be a useful source of biopolymers, but it needs to be looked into in a really, really complicated and a really detailed way to make sure that we're covering all the things and we're not just grabbing at a green label that says bio for the sake of it. We, and I know others, are also using waste materials from in production to then feed back into new yarns whilst they're still clean. And as Dennis mentioned earlier, that the long-term aspiration, of course, is to take the old fibers from the old fields, condition them, clean them slightly, and then extrude them into new yarns in the future. But that's probably a few years away at the moment.
Thanks, Colin. That was a great answer. Really, really interesting, and it just demonstrates the cycle of sustainability. And you can't do one thing without an effect somewhere else. So, a question for Lee. I'm just going to pose this quick one. Sorry, you'll have to unmute yourself, Leah. In terms of, do you think there's more that could be done in terms of in the education sector, in educating young people around, where the pictures come from, how they're made, all the rest of it? Is there a piece there that we could do to kind of embed that?
Yeah, I certainly think that when these projects are actually being built and we have all these specialists on site, contractors, from a school point of view, it'd be fantastic if there could be some input into the school, into the community. For example, in science, maths, it would be useful if there could be some input in terms of where the contractors, what is the technology involved, how can it link to the curriculum, even so far as, the people involved, how did they get interested in that line of work, and through that, develop awareness of sustainability. The LTA do some good work with School of Tennis, where a lot of their work can be linked to the curriculum, and it'd be brilliant for us if, you know, if one of the Football Foundation framework contractors, for example, could provide a pack to the school that could be made available to all staff, so that they could look at it and see how during the build we could perhaps look at taking students out to see when certain stages of the process, what they're doing. So I think there is potential there, without a doubt, and I don't think it's fully being maximised at the minute, but it certainly could be. And as a trust of schools, we'd be happy to liaise with contractors on that.
There's a challenge for you, Mark. If he's still listening.
Yeah, well, I take the point, Lee, and interestingly enough, I've been working with the Grounds Management Association, formerly the Institute of Groundsmanship. They have a school package, and we've been talking about how we can get that wider and further, because it's not just about educating the children, but it's also actually looking at this industry as an exit route and something to aspire to, whether it be groundsmanship or working within the sports industry. I don't think there's enough, this is a personal opinion, but I don't think there's enough tutors that are guiding children to actually look at, you know, where a lot of the alternatives are and where a lot of the innovation and you know, some great job opportunities. You know, not everybody's going to be a professional footballer or a hockey player or whatever, but you know, they can still work in sport, and there's such a wide variety of jobs in sport. We need to, and it's something that we're working on as the Football Association, in trying to make sure people understand that there's such a big opportunity for everybody.
I think that would be excellent, because, you know, the Football Foundation as a charity, they do excellent work. You know, our students have been to St George's Park, and we've had a variety of coaching courses, and this is perhaps just the link you mentioned there. Everyone wants to be a footballer. All of our boys and girls want to play for England. Clearly it's not going to happen, but certainly there's a wide range of careers that can fall into, but they need that inspiration, and having that built out there, they're all completely enthused by that facility, and it could open their eyes to, you know, a new career and hopefully, you know, a future for them.
Thanks. Thanks. It is interesting, because obviously getting in early and discussing sustainable practices at a young age is kind of how we're going to change the mindsets, aren't we? Liam, you said that you still got a few questions there. Do you want to do one last one? Obviously, I'm conscious of time.
Yes, so I'll just go down to the next one that came through, which was just wondering about greenwashing, and if this is an issue with regards to sustainable pitch development.
Okay, I think we've probably answered that one. I'm sorry, I'm just going to jump in there, because do you want to perhaps move on?
Yeah, we can move on. Just touching on the environmentally sustainable alternatives to infills such as cork, have they been found to be less effective than rubber infills, or do the problems centre around their lifespan or getting manufacturers to provide them at a good price point?
I'll take that one, Chris. So with organic infills or corks, sometimes they're best suited in different environments. So what we need to do when we tender and specify, we need to think about what's the performance of that material like. So some member associations and countries don't like the likes of cork or organic infills, some do. I think very clearly I would say that you need to go back to community and recreational pitches versus elite stadiums. And I think, you know, I would say, my personal view, the best stadium I've seen in the world with artificial turf had an organic infill. But likewise, the worst pitch I've seen in the world had organic infill. So it all goes back to what's the end use, how many hours, what's expected of the material. So they all have a place in the market. It's just where and how.
Just to add to Neil as well, it's all good points, and I agree 100%. Cork is only grown in a few countries, in a few regions, and it's a limited supply, and it takes a while to plant new trees and obviously take up the land and the issues like that. But as a natural alternative, it's got some interesting properties. But the supply chain volume issue, if we're replacing SBR and other types of polymeric infill with cork, it will not cover the area of fields that we currently install on an annual basis. It won't even come close to 10%. So whilst it is there and it is a viable alternative, it's not going to be a single solution. It will need to come from a multiple range of different alternatives, not just cork.
Great, thanks. Again, it's the wider discussion, isn't it, around alternatives and the impact they could have. Right, so I just want to wrap it up. Let's do it on a positive note. So Ed, interesting to hear from you post getting back to people playing sport, from what you guys have seen at 4 Global in terms of the demand that's out there. What's it looking like?
I think it's going to vary significantly across the kind of sports ecosystem. I think some sports are really well set up to thrive, and I think we've seen a big shift in the motivation factor across how people are involved in physical activity and how people are accessing different parts of physical activity. I think artificial and kind of all weather pitches have it's a good place, and have a good place in this because they are multi-dimensional. Lots of different sports or activities can use them. We're not going to see leisure centres open for at least a couple more, 2-3 weeks, but we are going to see a lot more group exercise. And actually, an artificial pitch is a perfectly good place to do all of those sorts of exercises. So I think they do offer a really high quality kind of specialist facility that people can use. And I think, over the next couple of months, it will be a challenge for clubs to get people back into the traditional sports. But the thing that we will still have is, come October, November, we will still have lots of rain. We will still have cold weather, and people will still be looking for the best possible experience. So it's everything from operators to individual sports clubs to just develop the best possible offer to make sure people continue to come through the door and kind of maintain their level of physical activity.
Great, thank you. That was a good positive pitch for synthetic turf. Thanks. Don't forget cricket. We play on grass. We're still there. Unfortunately, our season's been cut short, but we'll still be there. Okay, so just a quick whip around. Literally, we can just do it in a minute. So looking forward, looking ahead, and in terms of where, so looking at the sustainable elements here of synthetic turf and pitches, where we're going to be in, let's say, 5 years' time in terms of so regulations are one thing to consider, new materials, all the things we've been discussing. So, Joey, if I can start with you.
Yeah, sure. I think from my point of view, it's been a really interesting discussion, and actually it's really heartening to hear kind of the innovations, and accepting the challenges, but actually some of the innovations that hopefully we will see in 3 to 5 years, and some of the conversations that will have to be had, I guess, from a player's point of view about those evolutions and how that gets integrated. So, yeah, I think from a sustainability point of view, it's heartening, and yeah, it'll be some exciting changes as well as some challenges.
Thank you. Thanks. Dennis?
Sorry, I was reading one of the questions that was more interesting. Sorry.
Okay, well, answer it then.
Well, Fitra, I was asking a question, what is actually going on in the UK? And first of all, I wanted to ask Colin because I want to know what he's up to, but no, I'll answer mine. I mean, challenge around this industry with recycling is actually the legislation. Getting a permit to operate one of our facilities is kind of tricky, although we don't do much but separate some components. We cut a little bit into it and we heat it up and dry it. But it takes 12, 14 months to get a permit to run one of our facilities. They basically consider us as hazardous waste facility, despite we just process turf fields that has been out in nature for 10, 15 years.
Okay. Yeah.
And that is a challenge. That is why it's taken so long. But your original question, what was that?
No, that was, well, you pretty much answered it, because that's the thing. So what you'd like to see change in the next 5 years is exactly that. So,
that is exactly
a more considered approach to, Simon?
Yes, from an England hockey point of view, we are re-examining our facility strategy. Sustainability is something that's not really been in there. So we'll be looking to acknowledge the changes. As a sport, we're very dependent on manufacturers, constructors, and also national, international bodies, so the FIH, and also something we haven't mentioned, the IOC obviously have a large say in what happens within our sports. So we'll be looking at that. I think the best thing that's come out so far, and one thing that we will be moving on, we'll carry on talking to people and finding out how the industry and what the services are going to be, because it will massively affect how we play in the future.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks, nice, honest appraisal. Mark?
Yeah, I think some of the guys have touched on it already. I will continue to be working with the industry, the likes of Niall and Neil, Dennis and Colin, making sure that what we need and what our customers are talking about and what we need to look at are being at the forefront of what they're trying to do as well. Certainly keep pushing the recycling, but I think the most important one, and what Dennis touched on before, was we need to I need to work with Sport England, DCMS, to talk to government in relation to what sort of laws or rules or requirements are going to be adopted by ourselves. How are we going to make them stronger? Are we going to make them ourselves? We need to understand what the government position is in relation to a lot of these things, and we also need to get our government to be tighter on some of the legislation that it has in place at the moment. So certainly a lot of discussions with that government once we're out of the EU and not necessarily beholden to follow those EU laws.
Great, thanks, Mark. Duncan?
Yeah, where do I think we'll be in 5 years? I'm not sure, but what I am is pretty excited about the fact that we're having this sort of conversation, and excited about a number of things really. For the first time in a long time, there's a number of factors I think that give you hope or an indication that things aren't going to change. Firstly, customers are asking and are willing to take innovation on, whether it's a little bit more expensive or whether it's not been done before, but they can see the value in it. We're seeing that customer sector in parts take that risk on, or take a new product on, or a new design feature. And also excited because not only are they asking for it, we're hearing from manufacturers, as I mentioned, of all elements of artificial turf pitches, coming up with innovation. So whether that's new yarn, whether that's the polymers that Colin and Dennis have spoken about, infills, whether it's shock pads, whether it's all the other things I've mentioned, all these conversations are happening. And as I've mentioned to you before, Chris, it's been a long time since this feel that things are going to move forward and change, and that's just makes it really exciting. That's what we want to see, and that's what we want to take to the customers and provide the best possible solutions possible.
Brilliant, thanks, thank you. Lee, so education sector.
Yeah, I think in 5 years we would like to be able to better explain how our AGPs are sustainable and involve them more in the process when they are on site actually building these, so that in turn they can become more enlightened and enthused.
And from Ed's point of view, more accessible. Colin, your 5-year plan?
Well, I think what's really interesting in the backdrop of the turf industry, we see the European Union and other countries, and I'm sure the UK will have a version of this, coming up with some kind of Green Deal, of a 20 to 30 year plan to reduce carbon to net zero and all of these things. And that change, that overarching plan is already being realized in the limiting of microplastics, intentionally added microplastics. And as Neil mentioned earlier, they're likely to be banned, certainly in Europe, in the next 8 years, which in reality is the next 12 months to 18 months, because why would you install a field when you're only going to get 6 years out of it and then the infill becomes banned? So these changes that are being driven by a bigger green agenda, which is all really positive as far as we're concerned, are going to become more frequent and stronger, and that's only a good thing. And I think that's going to lead a lot of innovation, a lot of change, And I'm really excited about how we can rise to that challenge to take our responsibility. As an industry, we've been chucking literally tons of plastic and resources into the world for several years. So we've got Dennis and ourselves and others starting to recycle that mess, but then the next generation, we need to make sure we're not giving ourselves that problem and we're designing things sensibly. So I think that's really going to pick pace in the next 5 years through the legislative changes, driving it, but also industry rising to that challenge.
Thanks. That was a really good summation, pretty much, of what we're talking about. So, Niall, ending with you.
I'll keep it very short, Chris, but I think I will finish by saying this kind of platform is a great place for people to knowledge transfer and share. And with that, it gives educated decisions, it enables educated decisions. Now, in the UK, you know, we work in many different countries around the world. 44 were in last year. And I have to put my selfish hat on here and say in the UK, we're ahead of the curve in terms of understanding what we have as facilities. A lot of these countries don't even know the number of facilities they have. So I'm a glass half full guy, and I think we're in a good position, and we're seeing a lot of products come through, whether it be hockey, football, whether it be cricket, whether it be tennis. There's a lot of products coming through that are changing the curve, and people are accepting that change. So we're in a good position, I think, and embrace the change I think we have to do.
Great, thanks. Okay, well, I think we achieved what I was hoping to, which was it was a great debate, and we, you know, looked at the I'm not going to call it an issue because it's as I said, it's a much more balanced debate than that. And what I hope everybody out there who's watching came away with was a balanced view around, you know, the role that synthetic surfaces and artificial pitches play, you know, in the community and within the wider kind of social context. And then obviously the challenges that we face with what do we do with them, and how do we cope with their end of life. So I'm hoping we can continue this discussion, and I know obviously I'll be talking to you guys individually, but I also want to say thank you for coming on the panel, because it's sometimes easier to keep duck below the parapet than put your head above it. So it's, I really appreciate it, and thanks to Duncan for facilitating a lot of you guys coming on here. And finally, just want to say, as part of the basis thing, we've got 2 webinars coming up in the next couple of weeks. We're looking at the environmental sustainability at Wimbledon next year at the All England Lawn Tennis Club, and then the following week we've got an in conversation with Lord Deben, who's the chair of the Climate Coalition. So a lot to look forward to. Okay, again, thank you all very much, and hopefully I'll be speaking to you each individually in the next few weeks. All right, thank you.